Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 4th of May in the 18th week of 2012. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good people here at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussant tonight is David Green, and we will take turns suggesting overlooked or misreported items from the week's news, and then asking each other questions about what we've seen. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who has been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20 years we've been on the air, and much longer than the 200 shows apparently we've done with this evening's edition. Chomsky has said that in the American media, quote, either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Today is Friday, May 4th, the anniversary in 1970 of the Ohio National Guard's opening fire on unarmed students at Kent State University. 4 dead in Ohio, as the poet put it. The killing and wounding of students on a university campus demonstrated the extent to which the government and the universities would go to suppress dissent from the government's war policy in the midst of the Southeast Asian War. It's important to remember that this wasn't an accident, that it was in the context of policy that was occurring in American universities across the country. The problem was that by 1969, by 1970, by the time of the Kent State murders, 90%, closer to 70%, may have been later that much, 70% of the American public had come to regard the war in Vietnam, by then the war in Southeast Asia, as fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. And that's a result of longitudinal polls being taken of American opinion in those days. And it was, the conclusion had been reached largely as a result of the impact of student protest on the general political consciousness of the United States. That mass opposition, and I don't mean just on the university campus, but the mass opposition of the public, compelled the business community and then finally the government to stop the escalation of the war. But it took a long time in coming. There were many examples that we remember from those days. I was teaching in my first teaching job at the University of Notre Dame at the time, and I remember the night vividly that we heard the report from Ohio. We were in fact involved in a number of discussions in student dormitories. Faculty and student anti-war protesters who had been involved on the Notre Dame campus were conducting teach-ins in the style of the day that night. And as one ended and I was moving on to another one, a faculty friend stopped me on the way and said, have you heard the news from Ohio? First we heard of what had happened. We have to remember that contrary to legend, only a minority of student and faculty on American universities in 1970 actually opposed the government's position in the war. And in later years, like Crispin's Day, it was remembered with advantages. A lot of people told you what wonderful opponents of the war they had been at the time. I was there. It wasn't so. In fact, the mythology that it was the universities that controlled or contained the anti-war movement was belied by the actual polls of the time, which showed quite remarkably that support for the government's position in the war was directly proportional to years of formal education. That is, if you'd been to college, if you were in college, if you'd been to college, or worse yet, you'd gone to graduate school and were a faculty member, you were more likely to support the government's position in Vietnam than the general population was. And that was the real reason that the government had to move against this flame on the college campuses that they tried to snuff out by killing people, their usual way of doing it. In fact, the schools, the universities, were doing their job. They were manufacturing consent for imperialism, which after all serves only the 1%. And as I said, the Kent State killings were not an isolated incident, but were part of a general pattern of repression going on throughout American universities because of the effect that they were having on the general populace. I was teaching at the University of Notre Dame, and there the falsely celebrated liberal president made a great deal of his 15-minute rule, allowing students 15 minutes to object to the war in a demonstration on campus, at which time the police would be called, suppression would set in, and so, all right, well. So what happened in Kent State was simply an extension of the policy that was true everywhere. May 4th, 1970, 4 dead in Ohio, and the American government and ideological institutions continued to behave as they had, and indeed as they are behaving today. You remember Kent State, David?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
I hadn't been in college quite long enough yet to learn to support the war, so.
Good.
As you said.
Glad to hear it. Glad to hear it. You're watching News from Neptune, and this is the Killing College Students edition. David Green will begin with the first outrage from this week.
Yeah,
there are plenty, right, David?
I've come with a sort of a general. I've come with two issues. I'll give a little foreshadowing here. I do want to talk about a interesting article in the New York Times this past Saturday or this past weekend regarding Apple Corporation's skill at avoiding paying taxes and the response that received, at least in the newspaper itself, and from people like me who just read it with perhaps more shock than I should have, knowing what I already know, but still want to refer to that. But to keep the more international relations and campus orientation theme going, I'll begin with my other primary concern this week. And I must say that I feel that springtime events, Kent State notwithstanding, have become somewhat ritualized on college campuses. I'm not sure that I'm happy that college campuses bear the burden of political action in our country. It seems like political action should, of course, be much broader, and is in many ways, as we can see with the Occupy movement. But still, what this time of year brings every year on campuses around the country, and including our own campuses, is a couple of responses to the conflict in Israel and Palestine. The customary, what was once called Palestine Awareness Week on our campus has evolved into Israel Apartheid Week, in the second week or third week of April. And that is usually followed courteously during, in the post-Passover season by the Hillel-sponsored events on campus to declare support for Israel, to declare Israel's innocence, to justify what Israel does. And on the one hand, these events have become, I fear, a little too routine, and don't really generate the kind of interest that they have in the past, or at least as I imagine that they have in the past, maybe 10 years ago. But still, I thought the events of this year on our campus were of some note and worthy of mentioning on the program. First of all, the Students for Justice in Palestine put up a mock apartheid wall on the quad, and in it, I did not visit the wall personally, but from seeing pictures of it and then hearing descriptions of it, they adorned the wall with various various lists and messages regarding sort of fun facts about the Israel occupation of Palestine, and I'm sure it proved to be an informative experience for those who may want to become up to speed on the nature of the occupation, the nature of the wall, the nature of Israel's economic control over Palestinian life on the West Bank, and notwithstanding the wall, certainly the wall that confines Gaza also. Naturally, the good efforts of the Students for Justice in Palestine students to go to quite a bit of trouble and some expense to put up this wall received a sort of pro forma but still somewhat hysterical response from students associated with the pro-Israel organizations on campus, especially Hillel. A couple of the local Hillel sent out a letter which was forwarded by our friend Bob Naiman of Just Foreign Policy. The letter was signed by the chairman of the governing board of Hillel, Jeffrey Kaminsky, as well as the executive director of Hillel, Rabbi Rogerio Z. Kuckerman. And the letter decried the ostensible purpose was to inform supporters of Hillel, not only on campus, but presumably around the state and around the country, of the efforts of Hillel to counter the efforts of the Students for Justice in Palestine. Those efforts described as a campaign to delegitimize the state of Israel, which is the sort of the politically correct term now, or the politically correct way of accusing the supporters of the Palestinians for being harboring anti-Semitism. They're delegitimizing the state of Israel, which is a sort of an offshoot off of not recognizing Israel's right to exist, and so on and so forth. And in this letter, they complained that the large wall in the middle of campus tried to establish a parallel between Israel's policies in the West Bank and South African apartheid. While the comparison is a blatant misrepresentation, the truth is that the wall did attract attention from the campus community, and hopefully it did. They attempt to counter that with stories about their ability to attract attention and state their case the following week, having events. It's worth noting that the events that are conducted by the supporters of Israel pretty much parallel the narrative of the events that are conducted on a yearly basis, both in Israel and in by Jewish institutions in this country. There's a kind of ascent from the Passover story in spring to the celebration of Israel Independence Day, and in the midst of that is observed a Holocaust Remembrance Day, and B, a day which memorializes Israel's fallen soldiers and those killed in terrorist attacks for the history of it during the history of Israel, and indeed the whole Zionist movement. This sort of stuff, of course, would be relatively harmless or routine if it weren't in the midst of this sort of if it had not become sort of characteristic of the sort of propagandistic claims that go along, especially at this time when there is so much attention being focused on Israel and Palestine, and so much response to national efforts to boycott Israel, to boycott products from Israel, or divest from institutions in this country that support the occupation of Palestine by Israel. A particularly remarkable quote was made by the local Chabad rabbi in a letter, or actually an article in the Daily Illini, which recounted the observance of Holocaust Remembrance Day. He was quite bold in his politicization of this day. He said that the main message that we were trying to get out in being on the Quad is that we stand with Israel, and he said what the Chabad rabbi said. This is a university. It's a great place to speak, but when a student has to walk down the Quad, faced with the 20-foot wall, that is not bringing conversation. That is bringing intimidation and hate. So in case I don't, it should be obvious what the problem is with a statement like this. But what he's talking about is basically an informational wall on this campus, which of course isn't intimidating anyone. Instead of opposing the actual wall, on the West Bank, 90% of which is built within the West Bank, not on the border between the West Bank and Israel proper, and he is focusing attention on that benign, but in a very different way, threatening wall than the real wall that has really shockingly over the years just become a fact of life, a fact on the ground in Palestine, which is, of course, makes it very difficult to think about resolving this issue in a way that would result in a viable contiguous Palestinian state. So, having said all that, I guess I would just like to conclude by saying that the campus is a focus of a lot of pro-Zionist propaganda. You have the Jewish United Fund in Chicago promoting that, as I wrote about in a recent article in the News Gazette, and you have a lot of moneyed interests from Hillel, a wealthy national organization, promoting defense of what is really indefensible in terms of Israel's policy in Palestine, and opposite that you have a rather ragtag group, a local group. It's part of a national group, but a local group of Students for Justice in Palestine, which sort of garner their energy every year to do a couple of things, and for that receive intense criticism and accusations of hate and so forth. So it's a mismatch in more ways than one, but I think I applaud the efforts to inform the student body of what's going on over there and here.
Thank you, David. The most remarkable thing about the apartheid wall, which, as you say, is built on the West Bank, it's hardly a wall where the State of Israel has set up ramparts because of the threats of terrorism on its own land, which might be justifiable in law. It's the other extreme. The wall is built in the West Bank, and it's massively illegal. I mean, there's no question about that in terms of international law, and yet it's completely accepted in the United States, in the media, and so forth and so on. There's no argument about it. That's astonishing. And then we get this crazy argument about a demonstration on a college campus which has a wall, and the local supporters of Israel are busily doing their best Ronald Reagan imitation, tear down that wall, come on. I mean, this is, as someone once said, the first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. Yeah. I mean, this is farcical stuff when there is a tragic situation in the real wall that is part of the ongoing illegal occupation of the West Bank. It's not to be believed.
One thing I've noted, and interesting, year after year, as this this conflict has evolved through various stages and suicide bombing and through, you know, the various operations, the various attacks that Israel has made on Lebanon and Gaza and incursions into the West Bank, and with the ongoing occupation and expansion of settlements and things that you could just read about every day that aren't even reported on in mainstream media because they've become so routine in terms of the manner in which the Palestinians are subjugated to this occupation. I see less of a willingness, even among supporters of Israel, to defend the occupation itself.
A very good point.
There's been an evolution in the rhetorical tactics by which they justify the occupation, mostly by saying that, well, they oppose the occupation too, and they support peace too, but it just isn't helpful to do things like, to do something like build this wall, to put up this wall on this campus, because that somehow antagonizes people that need to be getting together and talking and understanding each other better. And so they really, even the supporters of Israel, have pretty much given up the ghost of trying to defend the occupation itself. They advise the Palestinians, well, you know, why don't you develop a healthier civil society, and maybe then we'll get somewhere. But without really defending Israel and without defending anything that Israel does, what some of these people are basically saying is that, yes, maybe we both have to change a little bit, but you're not changing, and you have to change first. And we kind of want to change, but we're waiting for you to change a little so that we can kind of trust you, and we really want peace too. So there's a kind of implicit recognition, I think, even by some of the supporters of Israel in this sort of even in this sort of staunch and reactive context, that what they're defending can't be explicitly defended.
In this context, what do you make of the debate within Israel right now on the quote, threat of Iran, close quote, and plans for attacks on Iran? You and I were talking before we went on the air about Uri Avneri's article in this week's Counterpunch on the Counterpunch website, in which he talks about the divisions in the Israeli leadership over this issue, and he has less than complimentary things to say about the present administration, as we would say, in Israel.
Yeah, well, it's always difficult when people who I don't have much respect for, obviously, have to be put forth as sort of, I don't know if counterfactual is the right word, but the people who usually aren't on quote unquote our side, when they come on our side, we use them to promote the fact that, well, even the people on their side don't agree on what's going on. So therefore, when these Israeli intelligence chiefs, of course, with very suspect and infamous histories of doing pretty nasty things, are, for pragmatic reasons, of course, I guess, saying that Israel needs to draw back from all this brinksmanship and to sort of identify themselves as the cool heads, in the sense that they're the ones analyzing what's going on, whereas the people that are in power, they're responding to popular forces. They may be subject to a certain kind of religious fanaticism, so on and so forth. Whereas it's the intelligence operatives that really understand the real threats involved and what may or not be prudent to do vis-a-vis Iran at this time.
It's also the case, it seems to me, that the entire discussion of Iran and the threats against Iran by the United States and Israel is conducted in such a miasma of lies that it's very difficult indeed to get any sort of handle on what's going on, except to counter the worst attempts to stampede, particularly the American public, into thinking that, oh yes, there's a monster here which must be assaulted. This was brought out, I think, recently when the discussion of the Obama administration's policy in Iraq made it ever clearer that what the Obama administration is concerned about is influence by the Shia government in Iran on the Shia government of Iraq. After all, the government of Iraq is supposed to be our puppet. I mean, we put these people there. They're supposed to be doing a job for us. It's supposed to be they're supposed to be a biddable lot who will do as they're told. And the thing that the United States is concerned about, of course, is this emergence of a self-conscious Shia region around the northern end of the Persian Gulf, running from Iran to the eastern half of Saudi Arabia, which is at once the oil-producing region of Saudi Arabia and the center of the Shia populace in Saudi Arabia. Now, at the same time, Saudi Arabia is busily supporting an anti-Shia regime in Bahrain as an agent of the U.S. And the U.S. is more and more concerned about the support from Iran to the opposition to its general concerns in the Middle East, that is, controlling the oil-rich region of the world. So it's worthwhile from the United States' point of view to have the lie of the Iranian threat to Israel and to have Israel appear as insisting that the U.S. do something about the threat, because, of course, what the U.S. is primarily concerned about is domestic radicalism, the reaction of the people of the region to the control that we insist on, because, after all that oil is under their sand, and we insist on controlling that oil.
So, from the perspective of Israel, these may be real divisions in terms of what should be done about Iran or not done, or when it should be done or not be done. But from the perspective of Washington, these are sort of being orchestrated in a larger context.
I think that's right. And part of the lies that the Obama administration is presenting to the U.S. about the danger of uranium enrichment in Iran. I mean, people think they've heard this story before, about, and indeed they have, but the willingness of the Obama administration to continue the lies about what its concerns in Iran actually are arise from the fact that the Obama administration can't admit that it's simply down with the constant policy of previous administrations, of the U.S. government, indeed almost since the Second World War, of controlling the region, and suggesting there are all sorts of oppositions to U.S. control, which we have to characterize some other way. They're terrorists, or they're Iranian agents, or something of that sort that we have to stop.
I just wanted to bring up one more thing in this regard. I guess I get a little uncomfortable with seeing Middle Eastern politics through the lens of Sunni and Shia, and how do we deal with that? In other words, the division, or the relationships between the Sunni and Shia population are certainly obviously an aspect of life in the Middle East. But in Iraq, for instance, they were never anywhere near as much of an aspect as we have seen since these groups have become exploitable through a kind of divide and conquer strategy, first by Britain and then by us.
Precisely.
And certainly Iraq under Saddam Hussein, he was identifiable. It was identifiable as a secular state, and it was sort of identified as someone from a Sunni background who, as is often the case, represented a minority controlling, having relative power over the majority Shia. But still, what do we have to watch out for in falling into this way of understanding Middle Eastern politics in these sectarian terms?
I think that's quite right, but I think you pointed out the crucial point. It was the U.S. in Iraq that exacerbated is too weak a word, that worked as hard as it possibly could to produce a Sunni-Shia civil war, and they succeeded. It produced a vicious civil war, which actually was the real reason for the relative piece of exhaustion that Americans attribute to the surge. It wasn't the surge at all. It was the fact that the U.S. had promoted the previously non-existent Sunni-Shia internecine warfare that produced the situation in which the U.S. could say, "Aha, we're establishing peace between these contending parties." A vicious civil war that the U.S. itself had produced.
So I would just, say that, I mean, it's convenient to talk about now there's a Shia government in Iraq and assume that they'll be pressured to be more supportive of their Shia brothers and sisters in Iran, but I really don't know enough about it to know what the complexities of it are. But I certainly don't assume that means as much as it's made out. It might be made out to mean even by critics of U.S. foreign policy. We're talking about two different countries and interests of two different countries and elites in two different countries.
I think that's very true.
And so there isn't any reason to think that there's any natural affinity between Iran and Iraq because of the Shia populations in those
natural
those
affinity
countries.
between Iraq, perhaps not. What I'm suggesting is that the thugs that we have left in place in Iraq do have relations with Iran. And the U.S. is very much concerned about the sort of support that those thugs might receive, so that they can become independent of the American, of their American backers, of the people who put them there. And certainly the Maliki government is thinking that way. There are other Shia organizations, Shia groups within Iraq that are also concerned about that, most notably Muqtada al-Sadr's group. And what I'm suggesting is that the U.S. hostility to Iran in the Persian Gulf region includes, but is not limited to, the situation which we have produced that allows Iran influence in Iraq. What we don't want is independence by any governments of the region. They all should be properly subservient, and we will go to great lengths, as we have shown, to make sure that we have control over these oil-rich countries throughout the region. You're watching News from Neptune on the anniversary of the murders at Kent State in 1970. It also happens to be the 50th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of South Vietnam. Now, whether you can work that down to a particular day in 2012 is hard to say, but what we are not attending to is the fact that 1962, 50 years ago, was the major invasion by the Kennedy administration of South Vietnam, which led on to what is still, in spite of all we can do in the Middle East, probably the worst atrocity in the post-war period. Millions of people, perhaps 4 million people, died from America's Southeast Asian adventure. We destroyed 4 countries and ways that they have even now not recovered. A complete horror story of American policy, and I didn't see any mention of it in the media in recent weeks, that we were looking at the 50th anniversary of the invasion of South Vietnam. Remember, the Vietnamese War also covered with a miasma of lies in those days and to this day. The American war in Vietnam was conducted primarily against South Vietnam, our supposed ally, because they did not have the good grace to accept the government we'd picked out for them. I mean, the U.S. has been doing that for a good while, particularly in Latin America, and was simply extending it to Southeast Asia. Here we have a perfectly good government for you. This Ziem family is ready to do the job, and you're resisting it. And that's not right. We have to have biddable governments in the region. A Southeast Asian example is almost more disturbing after all these years, if that's possible, than the Southwest Asian example that we were just talking of. In Vietnam, there was, in fact, no material prize in the sense that hydrocarbons in the Middle East have been a concern of the American government at least since the Second World War. Southeast Asia, American war in Vietnam was a demonstration war. We simply wanted to point out that no country within the American sphere, and the American sphere was essentially the whole world in the post-war period, no country in the American sphere could run a government and a society on principles of which we didn't approve. It's the mafia symbol. You don't do anything within the Godfather's area that is not cleared with him. This, by the way, mutatis mutandis, was what was going on in Serbia, why the Clinton administration attacked Serbia. They had learnt in the school about the importance of demonstration wars. But 50 years ago, the Kennedy administration sent bombers to Vietnam because we had an uppity client who must be taught the rules. As our mentor Noam Chomsky points out, it's not surprising that we don't recall this anniversary. It didn't happen because we did it, and so it didn't happen. It just disappears. And it's only when things like Kent State and so forth come up that we think about Vietnam at all and say, oh yes, that was long ago and far away. It was brought home again in another way this week. One of the other enduring legacies of the Kennedy administration in the early 60s was the reign of death squads that his administration established throughout Latin America. The vigorous foreign policy which Kennedy had advocated over against after the sleepiness of the Eisenhower years actually meant the establishment of these death squads throughout Latin America and the turning of Latin American militaries from hemispheric defense, which came out of the Second World War when the U.S. was trying to organize against influence of the Axis countries in Latin America, to internal subversion. That was the new enemy, and that had to be countered by murder. The situation prompted Malcolm X to say when Kennedy was killed that the chickens were coming home to roost. That is, that the policy of assassination was now being visited on the originators in Washington. The comment was seen as shocking at the time, but in terms of its accuracy about the historical situation, there was none better. I mention this particularly because Barack Obama is aping his Democratic predecessor with assassinations throughout Southwest Asia and North Africa. And of course, there's been some technological progress since Kennedy's assassinations. The special operation forces that are so popular in Washington right now in the Obama administration, and which the late commander of the recent commander of the Afghanistan war is now in charge of, and the drone attacks just extend the crimes of Kennedy's Green Berets and their local collaborators. They can be more efficient about it these days. I mention this particularly because Gareth Porter had an account of this event last week where Obama flies off to Afghanistan in the dead of night and signs some sort of agreement with our Afghan puppet, and then gives a speech in prime time on American television. Gareth Porter says, and I'm not always taken by his analysis of the situations he writes about, but I think he's right this time. He says, and I quote, "The only substantive agreement reached between the U.S. and Afghanistan, well hidden in the agreements, has been to allow powerful U.S. Special Operations Forces, SOF, that's the modern Green Berets, the modern death squads, the modern assassins, to continue to carry out the unilateral night raids on private homes that are universally hated in the Pashtun zones of Afghanistan." Yeah, that's right. That's what he was doing. But for home consumption, once again, see reference to miasma of lies above, this is played by the Obama administration as, well, we're out of Iraq and now we're winding down the war in Afghanistan, and we have an agreement with President Karzai that allows the U.S. withdrawal to continue. This is absolute nonsense. This is complete mendacity. The Obama administration is not leaving Afghanistan any more than it's leaving Iraq, in the sense that it is looking for whatever arrangement is necessary in order to make sure that the control of the oil-producing regions of the world and what Pepe Escobar calls Pipelineistan, the connection provided by Afghanistan, is always in American control. And I thought that we had another remarkable example of the bodyguard of lies, which the Obama administration, like previous administrations, was mobilizing over its Middle Eastern policy this week. So, special forces, drones, assassinations, Chomsky himself has pointed out that there is a difference, after all, between the Bush and Obama administrations. The Bush administration, those resisting American control of the region were imprisoned and tortured. In the Obama administration, they're simply killed. And along the way, a good number of others, including Americans, including American teenagers, are killed as well. And yet we seem to be willing to let this pass, at least for the time being. I'm constantly shocked at the folks who consider themselves progressives, even on the left, who are willing to give the child killer in the White House a pass on these matters.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. So, there is just, I've been observing, reading the accounts of Obama's decisions in the context of electoral politics and vis-a-vis what Romney might have done, and I'm continually astonished by the supporters of Obama who point one is he killed Osama bin Laden, and point two he's getting us out of Iraq, he got us out of Iraq, and point three he's getting us out of Afghanistan, and point four he's a great leader and all this kind of stuff, and as things wind on many different fronts, it's really clear that the almost cliche already from a month ago or so from Glenn Ford on the black agenda report is it's not a matter of lesser evil, it's the more effective evil.
Exactly. I actually meant to move on from this, but the events were the events are so incredible that you really can't. I mean, in his speech from Bagram Air Force Base. I mean, first of all, remember what this is. Bagram Air Force Base is the site of the major prison in which the American torture policies, by all accounts, are still continuing. And Obama speaks from Bagram Air Force Base, and the words have to be quoted. He says, "Good evening," from Bagram Air Base. "This outpost is more than 7,000 miles from home." That should give you a clue right there. What are you doing there? Huh? "Here in Afghanistan, more than 500,000 of our sons and daughters have sacrificed to protect our country." Now look, I mean, the 500,000 sons and daughters that he refers to, the total number of American military and as we say, contractors, that is mercenary, personnel that have been through Afghanistan in a decade of war. But remember, the important point of his observation at the very top of his speech is that these people were there to sacrifice to protect our country. That is absolute nonsense, and no one in the American political scene that I see was willing to call him on it, to say that this is an outright lie. I actually, it calls out for satire, and I found the following remark, the following speech, delivered on May 1st, 1942. 1942.
Oh, that was a real speech? Oh.
Allow me.
Sorry.
Allow me what I'm tempted to call my view to spree.
I've never been a good straight man. I'm sorry.
Perfectly all right. The speech David refers to, I posted, and so he's seen these.
It is a real speech. It is.
By the premise, you'll love the bit. No, you won't love the bit at all, because what I have in mind here are some words, presumably spoken by the German Chancellor from an obscure Polish town. My Polish isn't very good, but the town, it would be something like Oswiecim. The Germans had another name for it, but I mean Oswiecim was my Polish version of it. The German Chancellor speaks, May 1st, 1942. Good evening from Oswiecim Air Base. This outpost is more than 300 miles from home, but for years it's been close to our hearts, because here in Poland more than 500,000 of our sons have sacrificed to protect our country. Today I signed a historic agreement between Germany and Poland that defines a new kind of relationship between our countries, a future in which Poles are responsible for the security of their nation, and we build an equal partnership between two sovereign states, a future in which war ends and a new chapter begins. It's remarkable how similar these words are to what Mr. Obama said in Afghanistan the other night on May 1st, May 1st, 2012. Maybe even satire can't handle it. You're listening to News from Neptune, and we'll press on. David, do you have something else you want to move to?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, but before I would transition by saying, I referred to the manner in which Israel sort of has constructed this series of holidays and observances to lead up to Israeli Independence Day in a way to sort of justify its national narrative. And of course, we do the same thing in this country. We'll be celebrating Memorial Day in a few weeks, and then a few weeks after that, we'll be celebrating July 4th, and certainly no disrespect is meant to veterans in this country, but they deserve better than to have those holidays and those observances being used, as they always are, to justify our current wars. So I would like to be very clear about that. I would like to raise a question about Noam Chomsky in relation to my issue about Apple Corporation not paying taxes. Noam pretty much argues, he may get upset at people and he may, think people should do better, but he pretty much ascribes behavior, certain kinds of behavior, to the systems and institutions in which they operate. And certainly corporations not paying taxes or avoiding paying taxes or figuring out certainly legal ways not to pay taxes is one of those things that he might say, I'll try not to speak for him, but I have a sense he would say, well, of course, that's the way corporate CEOs behave. They're not bad people. They're doing what their shareholders want them to do, what they feel they must do to compete with other corporations. And I guess on reading the article, which I think is really important to read in this last weekend's New York Times, which has, by the way, received over 1,000 comments. And I noticed that the New York Times, I think, leaves its comment sections open for much longer now, because it realizes that when people get into an article, they keep going back, and I assume their advertisers pay more to them the more page views they get. So they used to shut these comment sections down in a day or two, and now they kind of leave them open. People have been commenting on this blatant the blatant spectacle of Apple, an incredibly rich corporation, looking for ways. The article emphasized California state government, since Apple is located near San Jose, California, in a place called Cupertino. It particularly highlighted the difficulties that the local community college there, which happened to be attended by one of the founders of Apple, not Steve Jobs, but another guy named Steve Wozniak, who, you know, as a kind of way of illustrating the fact that Apple came out of a climate which was well funded, in which education was well supported, was virtually free, even higher education, not only at the community college level, but beyond that in California, and it was quite an infuriating experience for me to read this article and realize what the choices that are being made by Apple, I assume the late Steve Jobs, and you know, not just the accounting department, but things must be done, you know, with the approval of the CEOs and so forth, and not as Noam Chomsky might ascribe some real moral responsibility to the behavior of these people who must understand at some basic level that the point of developing more, productive and advanced technological ways of doing things in our society really can't mean a lot unless the society itself benefits from them, and then they behave in a way that it makes it clear that not only the society, that in very real ways, the society, as we talk about, as the article talks about the differences between the way high tech and the manner in which it, because of the nature of what they do, sort of makes it easier to evade taxes, that they go ahead and do that, all the while impoverishing government, impoverishing society, impoverishing the basis upon which people can have good lives and really share in the wealth that these technological innovations are claimed to provide us. So back to my initial concern is what would Noam say about our moral judgments on the behavior of people who I think in a sense can be called sociopaths, for doing what they do, for not recognizing what children understand, that individual advantage shouldn't be gained at social cost.
Yeah, it's a point that, in fact, it seems to me that he's addressed relatively frequently when he said, why can't the leader of the CEO of a corporation or even the President of the United States simply decide to do something different? And he points out, yes, of course he can. I mean, there is such a thing as free will, but if they did, they wouldn't very often, or they wouldn't for very long, continue to occupy that position. The sociopathic personality is necessary to do the job, and if the sociopath should suddenly abandon his pathology, he'll be out of a job. That we're talking about institutions that promote sociopaths precisely because they serve the interests of the institution. I mean, is that difficult somehow?
I understand. I understand what he's arguing and what he's saying and what the argument is, but here you sort of have a little social experiment here where you have a rich corporation, an astonishingly rich corporation, which in the midst of all, you read about the manner in which these major corporations, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon.com, Facebook, compete with each other and the way they're being regulated and being sued and all this stuff. Apple doesn't compete. There really isn't anybody competing with what Apple has to offer. That's why it's become so fabulously rich. So if anybody can afford to do the right thing, yes, you would think it would be Apple. So, but even in this extreme case where things can be done, things aren't done. So maybe that just proves in spades what Chomsky's arguing, the force of these institutional rules and so forth.
That would be the way it would seem to me, I must say. The other thing that I wanted to mention today was a piece by Alexander Cockburn that was published in Britain, and I think will probably turn up on the Counterpunch website, in which he talks about the comments about fascism in the French election. There has not been much good coverage of the election, which will be concluded this weekend in France, the presidential election in France. But one of the things we've heard from American commentators is how there's one party there that is fascist, that is the National Front, the Le Pen party. Cockburn's analysis of what's actually going on there is important and should be attended to, but his conclusion is worth bringing home. A fascist regime is a sworn foe of the right of assembly, unauthorized marches and encampments. We're sure to see more signs of this around the NATO summit, that's in Chicago in this month, and the national conventions. America is a network of SWAT teams and kindred state-employed thugs on permanent red alert. A fascist regime spies obsessively on its citizens. Study U.S. laws on secret surveillance since the Patriot Act, and you will find procedures that would have been the envy of the East Germans. Ultimately, a fascist state claims the right to imprison its victims without term or hope of redress or legal representation. As the executive power in the form of the president, it claims the right to kill its enemies, whether citizens at Milwaukee or others at Guantanamo, without judicial review. In other words, rule by decree. That is what Hitler's Enabling Act won him in March of 1933. We live in a fascist country, proto-fascist, if you want to allay public disquiet, though there's scant sign that most Americans are stirred by the trends. So quit beating up on Europe. Worth considering, and I wish we had more time to consider it now. But you have been listening to News from Neptune for May 4th in the 18th week of 2012. Our program is named in honor of Noam Chomsky. This has been the Killing College Students edition. If our program interested you, you might want to look at these programs, heard regularly and repeated throughout each week on Urbana Public Television. Saturday, tomorrow at 7 a.m., the David Pakman Show. At 2 p.m., a repeat of this show. Sunday at 7 a.m., the White House Chronicle. At 3:30 p.m., the Alliance for Democracy, the Populist Dialogues. The topic this week is ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. And if you don't know what that is, it's worthwhile finding out about it, believe me. At 4 p.m., Labor's Worldview. Monday through Friday, regularly at 7 a.m., Democracy Now! At 8 a.m., The Big Picture. At noon, The David Pakman Show. On Monday the 7th at 5 p.m., The New Arab Debates, the third in a series. Has Egypt's peace treaty with Israel failed? On Tuesday, the 8th, at 7 p.m., the European Journal. At 7:30 p.m., a repeat of that New Arab Debate. And at 8:30 p.m., a new edition of that program where the topic is, Has Egypt's presidential election lost all credibility? These are real debates, and this is, I know of no place else in the American media that material like this is available. At 9:30 p.m. on Tuesday, the White House Chronicle. At 10 p.m., Aware on the Air, starring Ron Zoke. I'm Carl Esterbrook. My discussion tonight on News from Neptune has been David Green. This and other editions of this program can be seen on the website newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook. I'm happy to receive your comments. My thanks to our director, Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.